If you're trying to learn and practice copperplate calligraphy, a few tips and using a practice sheet will help you progress so much faster than winging it on your own. We do have a whole deep dive video course on copperplate that is linked in the description, but today we're going to focus specifically on practicing. You can find your copperplate worksheet practice sheet in the description as well, so let's dive in. Now, the number one tip for practicing copperplate calligraphy is to practice the fundamental strokes on a guide sheet. And this is the exact guide sheet that you can download in the description. On this guide sheet, we have printed guidelines, and then we also have the fundamental strokes. There's actually 2 pages. The first page has the fundamental strokes, and then the second page is just blank for you to practice with. So the benefit of using a guided practice sheet is you can focus on your consistency. When you're making these shapes, these are the building blocks of the letters. We actually have a whole video about the basic strokes and their history. But here, these are the shapes that we use in copperplate, and they build up all of the letters. So when you're practicing them, you want to use a guide sheet to be consistent. I'm going to just show you. So I'm using ink over here. I'm using a Hunt 101 nib, and all of the supplies you can find in our supply guide linked in the description. So right now I am tracing over this first stroke, which is called the entrance stroke. And by using a guide sheet, you can see that I'm keeping these lines consistent with each other. They are the same height as each other, and then also the same slant angle because I am directly following the printed slant line. This might be easier to see on the underturn here because we are going to directly trace over that slant line, curve around, and come back up for the underturn. And I'm using pressure on my downstrokes and no pressure on the upstroke so I can get a contrast between thick and thin. So now every single time that I make an underturn, I'm going to keep these lines parallel to the slant line, even if I'm not directly tracing on top of one of those slanted lines, for example, like this. I'm still aiming to keep this line parallel to the printed slant line. And by the way, that slant angle is 55 degrees. That's the standard angle used in copperplate calligraphy. You can also see the names of some of these other lines here. So the letters are going to rest on the base line. That's the line that we are writing on as our base. Then there's also the header line right here. That's where the top of most of these strokes are. That's also sometimes called the waistline. Just for reference, the in-between area right here is referred to as the X height. So that's the height of the strokes. And then you have first ascender and second ascender, and first descender and second descender. And using these lines again is going to help with your consistency. If you imagine trying to write on a blank sheet of paper, it's going to be much harder to, first of all, write in a straight line. So the baseline is what's going to help us write in a straight line and to keep everything consistent. Another tip is to make sure that your nib is aligned with the slant angle. So the long axis of the nib right here is at the same angle as my slant, rather than holding it like this, where it's not at the same angle as the slant. Then you wouldn't be able to get, if I try making this shape this way, that I'm not able to get the thick downstroke because my nib needs to be going in the same direction as the slant in order to get a thick stroke. So again, right now I'm using this pointed pen. This is an oblique holder. The brand is Moblique. I'm using a Hunt 101 nib, but you can also use, with this size of guide sheet, you can use a small brush pen like the Tombow Fudenosuke. That would work well for this size because the size of the nib of this brush pen is similar to the size of the pointed pen. And if you don't have a pointed pen or brush pen, you can always just use a regular pen or pencil. We actually have an entire video about pencil calligraphy, and pencil is a great tool to practice with so that you can get these shapes down without having to worry about things like ink. One of the most common mistakes that we see our students making is that they're using a guide sheet that is too big or too small for their tool. So for example, if you were using a guide sheet that was this size, this would be way too big for a pointed pen because you would not be able to get the right proportions. So this type of guide sheet would work well for something like a large brush pen. Here's an example of a large brush pen. You can see just how much bigger the scale is of the underturn with a large brush pen on a large guide sheet than if you try to use a pointed pen. And same goes the opposite. If you tried to use this large brush pen on a small guide sheet, the pen would be way too big. So make sure that if you're doing pointed pen or using a small tipped brush pen like a Tombow Fudenosuke, to use a smaller guide sheet like this. The spacing between the guidelines here on this particular one is about 0.3 inches, and you want to do somewhere around 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch. Definitely not more than that because that would be too big for a pointed pen. Another mistake that I commonly see with beginners is not using the guide sheet properly. When you're writing on notebook paper, you're used to just using a baseline to keep your letters straight. But when you're using a calligraphy guide sheet, the height also matters. So when I'm making this shape called the compound curve, I'm making sure to start at the baseline, and then I'm going all the way up to this line here, which again is called the header line, back down to the baseline, and back up to the header line. So it's hitting the bottom line and the top line in 4 points. You want to avoid doing something like this, where you're only touching the baseline. If you're writing in your normal handwriting, you might do that, but with calligraphy, you really have to be deliberate about touching the baseline and the header line at these different points. So for example, in the oval, you're touching the top and the bottom, and in all these shapes. So using a guide sheet can really help you learn your letter proportions. In these next two shapes, the ascending and descending stem loop, the ascending stem loop, they actually both start at the header line. So we're going to start at the header line and go up and back down. Now the question is, how high do you go up? In this particular example, we're going to go up 1 and almost 2 spaces, a little bit more than 1.5. So 1.5 would be about here. We're going to go a little bit more than that. Another way you can think about it is you're going to go almost all the way up to this second line here, which is called the second ascender, but stop just short of that and curve back around and come down. So we're starting at, if this is the baseline and the header line, the first ascender and second ascender. We're starting at the header line, going up, and the curve around just before you reach the top of this second ascender, and then follow the slant line back down. It's really helpful to practice by tracing like this so that you can get the muscle memory down. And then when you go to do it on your own, make sure to look at the example so that you remember what you're doing and follow the slant lines. So my ink just ran out right there. I'm just going to go back and fill it in. And finally, we have the descending stem loop, which also starts at the header line, comes down, and stops just short of the second descender line. This is the first descender, the base, and the header line. So you can see how knowing these lines will really help you understand the proportions. The amount that we went up for this loop, the height of this loop, is the same that we went down for this loop. So we're keeping the height consistent by looking at the spacing in the guidelines. So we've been talking about some common mistakes to avoid. We talked about using a guide sheet that is the right size instead of using something that's too big or too small. We talked about making sure that you are actually using these guidelines properly and touching the baseline and the header line for these strokes that are 1x height tall. And then another mistake to avoid is not referring to an exemplar. An exemplar is just some reference. Usually it's a historical reference or a reference from something like an online course that you can look at and make sure that you're making these strokes properly. So like we were just doing here, we're tracing this exemplar and then trying it on your own. And then when you try it on your own, you can compare it to the exemplar. So after you trace a few, and then you try it on your own, let's say you try it on your own and it looks like this, then you can use the exemplar to critique your work. This is another benefit of using the guidelines, is that you can specifically see, okay, so the slant angle of this right here, this stroke right here, I'm trying to draw a parallel line to the stroke that I made, you can see is not the exact same angle as the one that we're following in the exemplar. You can also see that the height of this loop was too short compared to the example that's printed here. So that's a really good way to critique your work, is by looking specifically at the proportions and the angles of these shapes and the letters that you're making. And once you get your fundamental strokes consistent, then you can make your letters consistent. So after you've practiced hundreds of ovals and you can make them consistently, no matter where you are on the guide sheet. So I actually really like practicing ovals starting where a slant line intersects a header line, and then I'm going to aim for this point right here to make sure that it's going along the right slant. And I make the left half of the oval, and then I think about just making the right half like a mirror image. Practice that motion and build up your muscle memory, and then you'll be able to do it even if you're not tracing over a guideline. Then when you go to put together letters, for example, the letter A, you'll already have the muscle memory down from that oval, and then the last part of it is an underturn, so you'll have the underturn down as well, and you can make your letters consistent. So a final mistake to avoid is using the wrong paper. You can see on this paper that I'm using here, which is HP Premium 32-pound paper. It's very smooth and high quality. The ink is flowing nicely. It's not bleeding. If you use something very thin or cheap, like just regular copy paper, then your ink might start bleeding and you want to get something that's more high quality. Another way that you can practice is by using marker paper, which is slightly transparent. So with the HP Premium, you can print the guidelines directly on the paper and then write directly on it like we're doing here. If you want to use marker paper is slightly transparent. So I have another exemplar printed here. This comes from our Copperplate course. And then here I have marker paper that I'm going to place on top. And the marker paper, like I said, is slightly transparent so you can see through and trace over these examples. Okay, so I'm going to put my paper on top. Now, another mistake to avoid, also as I'm talking, I'm going to clean off my pointed pen nib on the side with some water just to make sure that my ink doesn't cause the nib to rust. It's good practice to clean off your nib frequently and anytime you're taking a little pause. So one mistake to avoid if you're using marker paper, to make sure that you use paper clips. And using paper clips to secure your marker paper to your page will ensure that you stay in the same spot and that your paper doesn't move around. So I have 2 paper clips here. I usually like to line up the top left corner. This paper that I'm using, it's Canson brand. It's actually a little bigger than my printed sheet right here. But I'm going to line it up in the top left corner, and then I usually put a paper clip in the top right, and then also along the bottom left edge. Okay, so now we can see through and we can trace directly on top of this exemplar. So here we have some of these lowercase letters that are all in the same group. And we also have them broken down by their basic strokes. So like we just were looking at, the lowercase a is an entrance stroke combined with an oval, combined with an underturn. That's what the 3 strokes look like separately. And then when you put them together, they form the lowercase a. Oops. start of that underturn wasn't great. Letters in this group are all related to each other. So if we look at the next one, the lowercase d also starts with the same two strokes, entrance stroke and oval. This time we're going to start the underturn higher up. We're actually going to start it at the first ascender line. So if you remember the base line, header line, and then the first ascender line, that's exactly where we're going to start the next stroke. And we're just going to come down parallel to the slant line and then back up. So you can see the benefit of using a guide sheet here. We're trying to make this stroke exactly parallel to that printed diagonal line that you see across the page. So some of the pros and cons of using marker paper, obviously you can see that it's really easy to just trace over something that you already have printed, and then you can reuse this. So you didn't write on this, and that means that you can just either use another piece of marker paper on top and trace it again, or eventually if you want to write directly on this, you have this copy of it. I also just love using marker paper because it's so smooth and the nib glides on it really well. So if you're having trouble finding copy paper or printer paper that works well with your ink, then marker paper is a great option. One of the cons, though, is when you're finished and you take off your paper clips, then sometimes it can get, if you do want to go back and analyze your work, it can be hard to line it up exactly with the slant line to see where exactly you were. And also, if you aren't using paper clips and your paper gets misaligned, then you won't be writing in a straight line anymore if your paper keeps moving around. So again, make sure to avoid that mistake by using paper clips. Another benefit of using marker paper is that you can, once you go to make your own letter, so right now if I just pick one of these guidelines and I'm referring to the example here, and I'm going to try to make my own A, let's say it ends up looking like this, then you can move this around and go back over the example. You might have to do this after it dries, just so that you don't smudge the ink, but you can go over it and see that your A ended up being super wide compared to the example here. So then next time you do it, you'll make your oval and your underturn a little bit narrower. Our students love these tips and tricks for practicing because analyzing your work and having that skill to be able to refer to an example and compare yours and see where you need improvement is one of the best ways to improve. And speaking of students, we've taught more than 25,000 in our online courses. You can view our list of courses in the description of this video. We'd love to hear in the comments how your practice is going, what you're enjoying, what you're struggling with. And make sure that you go grab your free worksheet so that you can download it and print it and start practicing the fundamental strokes. Also, if you're enjoying this video, we'd so appreciate it if you gave us a like so that we know to keep making this type of content. And if you want to learn more about calligraphy, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and check out all of the resources that are listed in the description of this video. Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned a few new tips that are helpful for next time you sit down to practice copperplate.